The sun over West Texas was a merciless god, hammering the parched earth until the air itself shimmered with heat. It bleached the sky to a pale, hazy blue and baked the endless plains of grama grass the color of old bone. This was a land that offered no comfort and made no promises, a truth Jake Callahan understood better than most. He moved through it not as a resident, but as a predator, his senses honed to the subtle language of a landscape that was always trying to kill you. He tracked the man, Clem, not by sight but by the signs he left behind. A freshly broken twig on a mesquite bush, the scuff of a boot heel in the dust, the unnatural stillness of a jackrabbit that had seen a man pass. Jake moved with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving, his tall frame cutting a lean silhouette against the vast horizon. Every step was deliberate, every glance calculated. There was nothing wasted in him, not a motion, not a word, not a thought that did not serve the purpose of the hunt. This relentless focus was his sanctuary. It was the wall he built, stone by heavy stone, around the hollow space inside him. When his mind was fixed on the track, it could not drift back to the smell of wood smoke and baking bread, to the memory of a woman's laughter that sounded like wind chimes in a summer breeze. It could not conjure the image of a small boy with hair the color of corn silk, his face alight with wonder at the sight of a horned toad. Sarah, Thomas, the names were ghosts on his tongue, specters that haunted the quiet hours. They came to him in fragments, sharp and painful as shards of broken glass. The feel of Sarah's hand in his as they walked by the creek, the weight of Thomas, asleep on his chest, his small body rising and falling with each breath. These memories were not comforts. They were wounds, raw and septic, that refused to heal. He had found them in the ashes of their small homestead, taken by renegades who wanted nothing more than a few horses and a sack of flour. The senselessness of it was a poison that had soured his soul. In the wake of that consuming grief, he had made a promise to their ghosts, a vow spoken to the uncaring sky. Never again would he allow the vulnerability of love to take root in his heart. Love was a home, and his home had been burned to the ground. Now he lived on the trail, a man with no anchor and no destination, only a series of names on a piece of paper and the cold, hard certainty of the bounty at the end. It was a clean life, an empty life. It was all he had left. He found Clem hiding in a shallow arroyo, nursing a canteen of lukewarm water. The man was gaunt, his eyes wide with the terror of the hunted. He made a feeble grab for the pistol tucked in his belt, but Jake's own Colt seemed to leap into his hand of its own accord. The click of the hammer being pulled back was a final, definitive sound in the immense silence. "Do not even think it," Jake said, his voice a low rasp, dry as the dust under his boots. Clem's hand froze. Defeat slumped his shoulders. Jake disarmed him with practiced efficiency, bound his wrists, and pulled him onto the back of his spare horse. There was no conversation on the long ride that followed. There was only the rhythmic plodding of hooves, the creak of leather, and the oppressive weight of the sun. For Jake Callahan, it was just another day. The wall held, the ghosts remained at bay. The town of Redemption rose from the plains like a fever dream, a collection of sun-bleached clapboard buildings huddled together as if for protection against the emptiness that surrounded them. Its name was a bitter irony. There was no redemption here, only dust, desperation, and the suffocating influence of one man, Silas Blackwood. Blackwood's sprawling ranch. The Double B choked the life from the land for 50 miles in every direction. He owned the cattle, the water rights, the general store, the saloon, and most importantly, he owned the law. Sheriff Brody was a fat, sweating man with a tin star pinned to a perpetually stained vest and a spine made of jelly. As Jake led his captive down the town's single, rutted street, he felt the familiar atmosphere of fear. It was in the way people averted their eyes, the way they scurried from the boardwalk to let him pass, not out of respect, but out of a deep-seated instinct to avoid trouble. Trouble in redemption, wore the Blackwood brand. He saw the prejudice, too, as stark and ugly as a branding iron. A small Mexican-American community clung to the edges of the town, living in a collection of humble adobes. When a woman from that part of town tried to enter the mercantile, the proprietor blocked the doorway with his bulk. Shaking his head and muttering something Jake could not hear but whose meaning was perfectly clear, the woman retreated, her face a mask of quiet shame. Jake noted it with the same detached observation he noted everything else. It was the way of the world. He had no stake in changing it. He hauled Clem into the sheriff's office. The room smelled of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies. Sheriff Brody looked up from a plate of greasy food, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Jake. "Callahan." Brody grunted, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Figured you would be back sooner or later. That Clem Roper?" "He is," Jake said, shoving the warrant across the desk. "Wanted for train robbery in the Panhandle. $500. Brody grumbled but counted out the money from a lockbox, his movements slow and resentful. "Blackwood is not going to like you bringing your kind of business here." "My business is with the law," Jake replied, his voice flat. "What Blackwood likes is his own concern." He scooped the coins into a leather pouch and turned to leave. The transaction was complete. His plan was simple: a bottle of whiskey, a hot meal if the saloon served anything edible, and a bed in the livery stable. By sunrise, he and the dust of redemption would be strangers once more. From the shaded alleyway beside the general store, Maria watched the tall bounty hunter. She had been there buying flour, her meager coins counted out carefully, enduring the shopkeeper's sneer when he had ridden in. She saw the way he carried himself, the coiled stillness that spoke of a deep and dangerous competence. He was not like the swaggering cowhands who worked for Blackwood, all bluster and cheap bravado. This man was different. There was a finality about him, a cold purpose in the gray depths of his eyes. She lived in a small, weathered shack at the far edge of town, a place the respectable folk of redemption avoided. She was a pariah, the last surviving member of the Flores family. Everyone in town remembered the day, 3 years ago, when Silas Blackwood had accused her father, a good and honest man, of rustling his cattle. It was a lie, a thin excuse to seize the Flores land with its precious access to the river. But a lie was all Blackwood needed. He had whipped a mob into a frenzy, their faces twisted with hatred and whiskey. Maria had hidden in the root cellar, listening, her hands pressed over her ears to block out the terrible sounds, the splintering of their front door, her father's shouts of protest, her mother's screams, her brother's terrified cries. Through a crack in the cellar door, she had seen them, shadows dancing in the firelight of the torches. She had seen Silas Blackwood's face, illuminated by the flames, his expression one of cruel satisfaction. The memory was burned into her mind, a private hell she inhabited every single day. Now, she survived alone, selling the herbal remedies her mother had taught her to make. She gathered plants in the pre-dawn cool, yarrow for fevers, willow bark for pain, comfrey for wounds. Her existence was a quiet, stubborn act of defiance. She would not be erased. She would not forget. Beneath her calm exterior, her grief and rage simmered, a constant, low-burning fire waiting for a wind to fan it into an inferno. Later that evening, the wind came. From her place in the shadows across from the saloon, she saw him again. Jake Callahan was nursing a glass of whiskey at a corner table, alone. A group of Blackwood's men, brutish and loud, stumbled in. They were led by a thick-necked man named Jed, whose cruelty was matched only by his stupidity. They saw the stranger and saw an opportunity to curry favor with their boss. They surrounded his table, their taunts filling the stale air. Jake did not rise. He did not speak. He simply lifted his gaze from his glass and looked at them. The coldness in that look was absolute. It was not anger. It was something far more chilling, a complete and utter absence of feeling. Jed faltered, his drunken bravado withering under that dead-eyed stare. Jake shifted slightly in his chair, a small, almost imperceptible movement that brought his right hand an inch closer to the worn leather holster on his hip. The threat was unspoken, but perfectly clear. The saloon fell silent. Jed and his men, suddenly sobered, mumbled excuses and backed away, their retreat as pathetic as their advance had been arrogant. In that moment, Maria saw him not as a man, but as a force. He was not a hero. Heroes acted out of goodness, out of a belief in what was right. This man, she sensed, acted for his own reasons, and they were as cold and hard as the land itself. He was a weapon, forged in some terrible fire she could not imagine, and honed to a razor's edge. And she knew, with a desperate, terrifying certainty, that he was her only hope. The livery stable was dark, the air thick with the warm, familiar smells of hay and horse. Jake lay in the loft, his saddle for a pillow, his gun belt coiled beside him. Sleep would not come. The whiskey had done nothing to quiet the ghosts. They whispered to him in the rustle of the hay, in the soft sigh of the wind through the cracks in the walls. He was tired, a deep, soul-crushing weariness that had nothing to do with the long miles he had ridden. He heard a floorboard creak below. His body went rigid, his hand instinctively finding the cold steel of his Colt. He was on his feet in a silent crouch, peering into the gloom. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with a hesitant grace. It was the young Mexican woman, the one he had seen in the alleyway. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a low growl. He did not like surprises. She flinched at the harshness of his tone but did not retreat. "My name is Maria." "I did not ask for your name. I asked what you want. The stable is not the place for a respectable woman after dark." "I am not a respectable woman," she said, her voice soft but laced with a surprising strength. "Not in this town." She took a step closer, into a sliver of moonlight that fell from the hayloft door. He could see her face now. She was younger than he had thought, but her dark eyes held a sorrow so profound it seemed ancient. "I have come to hire you." Jake let out a short, humorless laugh. "I am not for hire. I collect bounties. If you have a man with a price on his head, you go to the sheriff." "The sheriff belongs to the man I want you to kill." Her words hung in the air, audacious and deadly. Jake's patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. He had heard countless stories of woe, endless pleas for help. He was immune to them. They were complications, entanglements that led to nothing but trouble and pain. "Get out of here," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am not a killer for hire. Whatever trouble you are in, it is not my concern." He turned his back to her, a clear dismissal, intending to climb back into the loft. He heard her move behind him, felt a sudden, shocking warmth on his hip. He froze. She had stepped close, her body just inches from his, and placed her hand firmly over the worn wooden grip of his holstered Colt. It was not a violent gesture, but it was one of ultimate intimacy and terrifying resolve. It was both a plea and a threat, a desperate claiming of the power he possessed. The touch was like a lightning strike, arcing through the worn leather, through the heavy denim of his pants, and branding itself onto his skin, for the first time in 5 years. A feeling other than grief or cold detachment broke through his walls. "His name is Silas Blackwood," she said, her voice trembling but gaining force with every word. The story tumbled from her then, a torrent of pain and rage held back for too long. She spoke of her family, of their land, of the lie Blackwood had told, and of the night the mob came. She did not weep. Her voice was flat, burned clean of tears, but it held the weight of 1,000 unshed ones. When she finished, the silence in the stable was absolute. She removed her hand from his gun and stepped back. From a small pocket in her dress, she pulled out a worn deerskin pouch. It jingled softly as she held it out to him. "It is all I have," she whispered. $112. My life savings. It is yours. For him. Jake stood motionless, his back still to her. The audacity of her, the sheer force of her will, had left him speechless. The fire in her voice, the unyielding strength in her eyes that he had seen in the moonlight, it reminded him of Sarah. It was a faint, painful echo of a light he had thought was extinguished from the world forever. The memory was an agony, and he recoiled from it, from her, from this feeling she had awakened in him. He turned slowly, his face a mask of stone. He did not look at the money she offered. He looked into her eyes. "My gun is for collecting bounties," he said, his voice hard as flint. "Not for settling personal scores. Your fight is not my fight." He turned away again, climbing the ladder to the loft without a backward glance, dismissing her as completely as if she were a ghost. He heard her stand there for a long moment, then the soft sound of her footsteps as she retreated back into the night. He lay down in the hay, but the stable no longer felt empty. He could still feel the phantom pressure of her hand on his gun, a lingering heat that the cold night air could not cool. The raw agony in her voice echoed in his mind, drowning out the familiar whispers of his own ghosts. The wall he had so carefully constructed around his heart had been breached. A single, tiny flicker of something new, something other than grief, had been ignited in the darkness, and it terrified him. Jake awoke before the first hint of dawn, his body accustomed to the rhythm of the trail. For a moment, he lay still in the hayloft, the scent of dust and dry grass filling his nostrils. The ghosts had been relentless during the night, their whispers mingling with the memory of a woman's desperate plea. He had pushed it all away, rebuilding the walls of his solitude with grim determination. Today he would ride out. He would put redemption and its troubles behind him until they were nothing more than a bad memory. He would forget the feel of her hand on his gun. He swung down from the loft, his boots thudding softly on the packed earth of the stable. But as he reached for his saddle, a strange stillness settled over the world. The usual pre-dawn chorus of crickets had fallen silent. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an unnatural energy. Through the open stable doors, he saw the eastern horizon, which should have been turning a soft gray, was instead a bruised, sickly shade of yellow-brown. A low moan began in the distance, a sound that seemed to rise from the very plains themselves, growing steadily into a deep, guttural roar. The storm hit with the force of a physical blow. A wall of roiling dust, thousands of feet high, descended upon the town, swallowing the light and plunging the world into a gritty twilight. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the roofs of the buildings and driving a blinding, stinging torrent of sand through every crack and crevice. Jake's horse whinnied in terror, its eyes wide. The world beyond the stable doors ceased to exist, replaced by a churning, suffocating chaos. He was trapped. To ride into that maelstrom would be suicide. Redemption, the town he was so desperate to flee, had become his prison, and the storm its unbreachable walls. He cursed under his breath. A low, bitter sound lost in the shriek of the wind. He was being held hostage by the weather, forced to remain in proximity to the one person who had managed to find a crack in his armor. He felt a grim sense of foreboding. The plains were not ready to let him go. Hours passed. The storm did not abate. It scoured the town, a relentless siege of wind and grit. Jake, driven by a restless energy, left the relative shelter of the livery. He pulled his hat down low and tied his bandana over his nose and mouth. His eyes narrowed to slits against the assault. The main street was a desolate landscape, the air so thick with dust he could barely see 20 feet ahead. He decided to get what supplies he could from the mercantile, to be ready to ride the instant the storm broke. He pushed his way through the swinging doors, the wind slamming them shut behind him. The air inside was hazy with dust, the light from the lanterns casting a murky, jaundiced glow. A few townspeople were huddled within, their faces grim, and then he saw her. Maria was standing at the counter, a small basket of neatly bundled herbs in her hand, trying to barter with the sullen proprietor. Before the shopkeeper could answer, the doors burst open again, admitting another blast of wind and two familiar figures. It was Jed and Pike, the two ranch hands from the saloon. They stomped the dust from their boots, their faces flushed from leaning into the gale. Their eyes landed on Maria, and a shared, ugly sneer spread across their faces. "Well, look what we have here," Jed boomed, his voice unnervously loud in the tense quiet. "If it is not the little half-breed medicine woman." Maria ignored them, her back rigid. Pike stepped forward and poked at her basket with a dirty finger. "What is this garbage you are trying to sell, girl? Some of your witching potions." He laughed, a coarse, unpleasant sound. "It is not for you," Maria said, her voice quiet but firm. Jed moved to stand beside her, his bulk crowding her against the counter. "You got a lot of nerve coming into the white part of town. Blackwood should have run you out with the rest of your kind." His words were venomous, each one a calculated strike meant to wound and humiliate. Jake watched from the back of the store, his jaw tight. He told himself to stay out of it. It was not his fight. He was a ghost in this town, just passing through. But the sight of the two large men looming over the solitary, defiant woman ignited a cold fire in his gut. It was the ugliness of it, the lazy, cowardly cruelty of the strong preying on the weak. It was a violation of a code that ran deeper than his vow of solitude, a remnant of the man he used to be, the Texas Ranger who stood for the law. He remembered Sarah, her fierce intolerance for bullies, and a dormant, protective instinct stirred within him. Pike, growing bolder, suddenly slapped the basket from Maria's hands. It hit the floor with a clatter, scattering dried herbs and breaking a small clay pot. The fragrant scent of lavender and sage filled the dusty air. That was enough. Jake did not say a word. He simply moved. He covered the distance between them in 3 long, silent strides. He did not draw his gun. He did not need to. He stepped directly in front of Maria, shielding her with his body, and fixed his gaze on Jed. The cold, gray stillness in his eyes was more menacing than any weapon. Jed and Pike froze, the sneers vanishing from their faces. They remembered that look from the saloon. They remembered the lethal promise coiled in the man's frame. They were bullies, not fighters, and they knew with an absolute certainty that they had pushed too far. "We were just having some fun," Jed mumbled, taking a step back. Jake did not move, did not blink. His silence was a judgment, and it unnerved them more than any threat could. "Come on, Pike," Jed said, grabbing his friend's arm. "Let us go." They practically scrambled out of the store, swallowed once more by the raging storm. The mercantile was silent save for the howling of the wind. Maria was kneeling, her movements stiff with shock and anger as she began to gather her scattered belongings. Jake felt a sudden, unfamiliar awkwardness. His only impulse was to turn and walk away, to retreat back into his solitude, but his feet would not move. He looked down at the herbs and tinctures, the product of her hands, her only livelihood, strewn across the filthy floorboards. Against his better judgment, he knelt and began to help her, his large, calloused fingers clumsy as he picked up the delicate, dried leaves. Later, when the storm had lessened to a mournful gale, she found him in the stable. He was currying his horse, the repetitive motion a way to occupy his hands and his mind. He heard her approach and did not turn around. "Go away," he said, his voice flat. "I came to thank you," she said, ignoring his dismissal. "I did not do it for you. I dislike loudmouths." He kept his back to her, focusing on the horse's flank. "You are hurt." He paused. He had forgotten about the small, sharp piece of the broken pot that had sliced across the back of his hand. It was a shallow cut, barely bleeding, but she had noticed. "It is nothing," he said, resuming his work. "Please," she insisted, her voice soft. Let me clean it. It is what I do." He finally turned, intending to refuse, but he stopped when he saw her face, in the dim light of the stable. Her expression was not one of gratitude, but of a quiet, solemn purpose. He saw the healer in her. Reluctantly, with a sigh of irritation, he held out his hand. She took it gently. Her fingers were slender but strong, her touch surprisingly warm against his cold skin. From her basket, she took a small bottle and a clean strip of cotton. She uncorked the bottle, and the sharp, clean scent of an herbal tincture cut through the air. As she dabbed the liquid onto the cut, he felt a sharp sting, followed by a spreading, soothing warmth. It was such a simple act, a moment of human kindness, but for Jake, it was profound. No one had touched him with such gentleness in 5 years. The feeling was both alien and achingly familiar, a ghost of a sensation he had buried long ago. It was the warmth of Sarah's hand on his brow when he was sick with fever. It was the simple, uncomplicated comfort of another person's care. He looked down at their hands, his scarred and calloused from years of hard living, hers stained with the earth and plants she worked with. He followed the line of her arm up to her face. She was focused on her task, her dark lashes lowered. When she finished wrapping the cotton around the cut, she looked up, and their eyes met. In that instant, the silence was filled with an unspoken understanding. He saw the full depth of her loss, the ocean of grief she navigated every day, and in his eyes, for the first time, she saw not coldness, but the vast, empty wasteland of his own sorrow. They were two survivors, two souls hollowed out by tragedy, standing together in the quiet of a dusty stable. The storm outside seemed to fade away, and the walls around Jake's heart seemed to thin, just for a moment, allowing a flicker of warmth to penetrate the frozen core. The dust storm raged for 2 days, imprisoning Jake in redemption and in his own conflicted thoughts. The encounter with Maria had unsettled him more than any gunfight ever had. He could not shake the feeling of her touch, or the deep, silent connection that had passed between them. His carefully maintained detachment was fraying at the edges, against all his better instincts. His curiosity had been ignited. He told himself it was just a way to pass the time until the weather cleared, a puzzle to occupy his mind. He told himself it did not mean anything. He found Dr. Miller in the saloon, hunched over a glass of whiskey, his hand trembling slightly. The doctor was a man haunted by his own weakness, his face a roadmap of regret. Jake sat down across from him and slid a coin across the table. "Another for the doctor," he told the bartender. Miller looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wary. "What do you want, bounty hunter?" "Information," Jake said simply, "about the Flores family." The doctor flinched, a spasm of old guilt crossing his face. He downed his whiskey in one gulp. "That is old history, better left buried." "Some things do not stay buried," Jake countered, his voice low and even. "I hear you were the one who signed the death certificates." Miller laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "I signed them. Said they died resisting a lawful posse. That is the official story." He leaned in, his breath sour with whiskey. "Official stories, in this town, are whatever Silas Blackwood says they are. He wanted that land. The river runs along the northern edge. In a dry year, that is the difference between life and death for a herd." He shook his head, looking down into his empty glass. "They were good people, decent people. It was a black day. Callahan, a black day." The doctor's drunken confession painted a grim picture, but Jake wanted more. He found the young stable hand, Ben, checking the horses. The boy was nervous, his eyes constantly darting toward the saloon, but there was a core of resentment in him that Jake recognized. Leaning against a stall, Jake spoke quietly. "I heard you were working here the night the Flores family was killed." Ben froze, his face paling. "I do not know anything about that." The doctor seems to think it was not a lawful posse. Jake pressed, his voice calm, non-threatening. He seems to think it was a mob led by Silas Blackwood. The boy's fear warred with a deeper anger. My older brother, he spoke out against it, Ben whispered, his voice cracking. Said it was murder, plain and simple. A month later, one of Blackwood's men claimed he caught him stealing a horse. We found him on the trail back from Abilene. Sheriff called it an accident. He looked at Jake. His young face hardened with a grief that was still fresh. The Flores family was innocent. Everyone in this town knows it. But knowing and speaking are two different things. Speaking gets you killed. The truth, when it was finally laid bare, was uglier than Jake had imagined. It was not just a tragic injustice. It was a cold-blooded campaign of theft and murder, sanctioned by fear and official corruption. A quiet, simmering anger began to burn in Jake's chest, an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel for a long time. He did not have to wait long for the consequences of his inquiries. The next afternoon, as the dust began to settle, Silas Blackwood rode into town. He was flanked by 6 men, a clear and deliberate display of power. Blackwood was a handsome man in his 50s, with silvering hair and the confident bearing of someone born to rule. He dismounted in front of the saloon where Jake was standing and approached him, a placid smile on his face that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. Mr. Callahan, Blackwood said, his voice smooth as polished wood. I have been hearing your name all over town. It seems you have taken an interest in our local history. I hear what people have to say, Jake replied, his posture relaxed, belying the tension coiling in his gut. Gossip and rumor, Blackwood said with a dismissive wave of his hand. The past is the past. My concern is the future of this town, a peaceful, prosperous future. Men like you, who drift in and stir up old ghosts. You are bad for business. He nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward and held out a heavy leather pouch that clinked with the sound of gold coin. I understand you are a man of commerce. This should more than compensate you for your time in our humble community. Consider it a gesture of goodwill. I would advise you to take it and be on your way before the sun sets. It was not a request. It was an order, wrapped in the thinnest veil of civility. Take the bribe and run, or else— Jake looked from the bag of gold to Blackwood's arrogant face. He saw the rot, the absolute certainty of a man who believed himself to be above any law, any morality. Contempt, cold and pure, washed through him. I am not for sale, Jake said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute finality. He turned his back on the rancher and walked into the saloon. That night, the storm broke. The air was washed clean, and a million stars glittered in the cold, black sky. The sudden peace was unsettling. From the hayloft, Jake saw a flicker of orange against the dark line of the horizon. In the direction of the edge of town, the flicker grew, blossoming into a hungry, malevolent glow that painted the underside of the clouds with blood and fire. He knew, with a sickening certainty, what it was. He ran through the muddy streets, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He ran toward the flames that were consuming the last remnants of Maria's life. He found her standing 100 yards from the inferno, a solitary figure wrapped in a thin blanket against the sudden chill. She was watching the flames devour her small home, her face illuminated by the destructive light. The shack collapsed in on itself with a roar, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Everything was gone. The last physical traces of her family, every humble possession she owned, had been turned to ash. She stood motionless, her fierce spirit, the one that had so stunned him, finally extinguished. Her face was a mask of utter, soul-shattering desolation. She was not crying. Her grief was too profound for tears. The sight of her broke him. The wall he had spent 5 years building, the vow that had been the cornerstone of his empty existence, crumbled to dust. In her utter devastation, he saw the reflection of his own. He saw the smoking ruins of his own home, felt the phantom agony of his own loss as if it were happening all over again. They were the same. The details were different, but the hollow ache in their souls was identical. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent in the damp grass. She did not seem to notice him until he was standing beside her. He said nothing. Words were useless in the face of such a loss. He shrugged off his heavy canvas duster, the one that had protected him from countless storms, and gently wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. The coat enveloped her small frame, smelling of leather, dust, and him. He looked from the smoldering ruins of her past to her face, a pale oval in the darkness. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a rough, raw sound, torn from a place deep inside him he thought had died long ago. "I will help you," he said. The words were an oath. It was no longer about a bounty, no longer about a job he had rejected. It was no longer just for her. It was for him, too. It had become deeply, irrevocably personal. He led her away from the skeletal, smoking ruins of her home, his hand a firm and steady presence on her arm. She moved as if in a trance, the heavy duster he had given her trailing in the damp earth. The walk back to the sleeping town of redemption was a journey through a silent, shared landscape of grief. There were no words that could fill such a void. So they walked in silence, two solitary figures moving through the cold, pre-dawn darkness. The room above the livery stable was small and stark, containing only a narrow cot, a single wooden chair, and a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin. The air was close, smelling of old wood, trail dust, and the faint, masculine scent of Jake himself. For Maria, who had known nothing but the open sky and her own small space, the room felt like a cage, yet the solid walls were also a strange comfort after the terrifying vulnerability of the night. The intimacy of the small room was immediate and tense. It was a space built for one person, and their sudden, forced proximity filled it to overflowing. Every sound was magnified. The creak of the floorboards as he moved, the soft whisper of her borrowed coat as she sat on the edge of the cot, the ragged cadence of their breathing. "You should get some sleep," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small space. He did not look at her as he spoke. She nodded, though she knew sleep was an impossible dream. She watched as he took the single, thin blanket from the cot and laid it on the floor in the corner. He was giving her the bed. The simple, unspoken gesture of care was a small, warm stone dropped into the cold well of her despair. That first night, they existed in a state of suspended awareness. She lay on the cot, wrapped in his coat, staring into the darkness, the fiery images of her home burning behind her eyelids. He lay on the floor, his gun belt within arm's reach, his back to her. He was a sentinel, a guardian. Yet the wall he kept around himself was as solid and unbreachable as ever. He was listening to the sound of her quiet, fitful breaths, a sound that was achingly out of place in the stark solitude of his life. In the days that followed, the small room became their world. They began to talk, not in a rush of confession, but in cautious, fragmented offerings. Each disclosure was a tentative step across the broken ground of their shared tragedy. One morning, as she stared out the single dusty window, she spoke of the small rosemary bush her mother had planted by the door, wondering aloud if it had survived the fire. Another afternoon, as he cleaned his rifle, Jake mentioned in a flat, dispassionate voice that his wife, Sarah, had always hated the smell of gun oil. These were small, splintered pieces of their past, offered up like fragile gifts, slowly building a bridge of trust between the ruins of their two lives. On the third morning, Jake laid a second pistol on the small table. It was smaller than his Colt, a Smith & Wesson with a polished walnut grip. Maria looked at it, then at him. "Blackwood knows we are together now," he said. his voice leaving no room for argument. "He tried to warn us both with that fire. The next time, it will not be a warning. You need to know how to protect yourself." He took her to a secluded hollow a mile out of town, a place sheltered by cottonwoods and scattered boulders. The world felt quiet and empty here, far from the prying eyes of redemption. He began the lesson with a detached, professional tone, explaining the parts of the weapon, the heft and balance of it, the deadly purpose for which it was designed. Maria listened, her hands clasped together to keep them from trembling. The gun felt unnaturally heavy in her palm, a cold, alien weight. It was an object of violence and death, everything she was not. "You are holding it too tight," Jake said. "You need to be firm, but relaxed." He stepped behind her, and the dynamic shifted in an instant. The space between them evaporated. His broad chest was a solid wall against her back, and his arms came around hers, his large, calloused hands covering her own to adjust her grip on the pistol. The professional distance he had tried to maintain dissolved into an intense, charged intimacy. Maria was acutely aware of everything about him, the solid strength of his body shielding hers, the warmth of his breath near her temple, the rough texture of his shirt against her cheek, the smell of gunpowder and gun oil mingled with the clean, herbal scent of the soap she used, a strange and potent combination. "Extend your arms," he instructed, his voice a low murmur directly beside her ear. "Look down the sight. Find your target." She tried to focus on the tin can he had placed on a distant rock, but her senses were overwhelmed by his proximity. He was a fortress at her back, his presence so powerful it seemed to sap the very air from her lungs. She pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil of violent shock that threw her body backward, hard against his. He absorbed the impact without moving, his arms a steadying cage around her. The scent of acrid smoke filled the air. "Again," he commanded, his voice unwavering. They continued for over an hour. With each shot, her fear lessened, replaced by a growing focus, and with each recoil, with each necessary adjustment of her hands and arms, the physical barrier between them grew thinner. He was the teacher, and she was the student. But this lesson was about more than just a gun. It was about trust, about shared purpose, about the undeniable current of longing that flowed between them in the quiet space between the thunderous reports of the pistol. He was trying to arm her for the fight to come, but in doing so, he was disarming himself, letting her pass the defenses he had held for so long. That evening, back in the suffocating confines of the room, the air thick with unspoken things, they devised their strategy. They sat at the small table, a map Jake had drawn in the dirt now committed to paper. "Killing Blackwood is not enough," Jake said, his finger tracing the lines of the local rivers and properties. "If I ride up to his ranch and put a bullet in him, his men will hunt you down before my horse is even out of the territory. The law, such as it is in redemption, will call me an outlaw and you an accomplice. Nothing will change. In a year, Jed or some other brute will be running the Double B, and he will be just as bad." His words were grim, but they carried the weight of experience. This was the former Texas Ranger speaking, the man who understood that justice was a more complex machine than simple revenge. "So what do we do?" Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We dismantle his empire," Jake answered, his gray eyes intent. "We find proof of his crimes, real proof. The doctor and the stable hand will not be enough to bring in the federal marshals. We need something undeniable. Ben, the stable hand, said his brother was killed after speaking out about the rustling. Blackwood did not kill your family for a strip of land. He killed them because your father knew something. We find proof of his cattle rustling, and we can strip him of everything, his land, his money, his power. We can give the town back to its people." Maria looked at him, at the fierce intelligence burning in his eyes. For the first time since the fire, a flicker of something more than just the desire for vengeance ignited within her. It was a fragile, dangerous hope. Their personal quest had transformed into something larger, a fight for true justice. They were no longer just two broken people seeking retribution. They were partners. They left Redemption 2 nights later, two shadows slipping out of town on horseback under the faint light of a crescent moon. They rode east, toward the harsh, desolate Badlands, a maze of jagged canyons and sun-blasted mesas where a man could disappear for good. The landscape was brutal and unforgiving, a perfect mirror for the task that lay ahead of them. The journey tested them to their limits. The days were blistering hot, the nights deceptively cold. Water was scarce, and the threat of discovery was a constant companion. They fell into a rhythm born of necessity, their reliance on each other becoming as natural as breathing. He taught her how to read the subtle signs of the trail, to find water by watching the flight of birds. She showed him which plants could be eaten, which roots held water, and how to make a poultice for a rope burn from the leaves of the prickly pear. Their skills, born of two vastly different lives, intertwined to form a single, resilient cord of survival. Danger was ever present. One afternoon, a diamondback rattlesnake, coiled in the shade of a rock, struck out as she passed. Jake's arm shot out like a whip, yanking her backward a split second before the fangs could find their mark. The incident left her trembling, not with fear of the snake, but with the raw, potent realization of how completely she depended on him. Another day, a sudden thunderstorm turned a dry wash into a raging, muddy torrent, forcing them to scramble up a steep cliff face, their fingers scrabbling for purchase as he pushed her from below and pulled her from above. Huddled on a narrow ledge, drenched and shivering as the storm raged around them, they were no longer two people, but a single entity, clinging to life together. Their reliance deepened into a powerful, unspoken bond, forged in the crucible of shared hardship. The emotional walls between them, already weakened, began to crumble under the relentless pressure of their journey. One night, they made camp in a small, sheltered cove, protected from the wind by towering spires of red rock that clawed at the night sky. The fire was small, barely a handful of embers, providing a tiny pocket of warmth in the immense, cold silence of the wilderness. Above them, the sky was a vast sweep of black velvet, so clear and deep it felt as if they could fall into it forever. The stars were not distant sparks, but brilliant, blazing diamonds scattered across the heavens. In the profound silence, surrounded by a beauty so vast it was almost painful, the emotional dam that held back years of unspoken grief finally broke. Maria was watching his face, illuminated by the soft glow of the embers. He seemed 1,000 miles away, his gaze fixed on the flames, his expression etched with a sorrow so deep it stole her breath. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Jake was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was a rough, thick rasp, heavy with unshed tears. "Her name was Sarah," he began, the words tasting like rust and ashes in his mouth. He had never spoken her name to another soul since the day he had lost her. "My son's name was Thomas. He had his mother's laugh. He told her everything. He did not spare himself, or her, the horrific details of the story he had carried alone for 5 years. He spoke of being away on a ranger patrol, of the gut-wrenching feeling of unease that had driven him to ride for 2 days without rest. He described finding the homestead, not just burned, but silent. A silence that was louder and more terrible than any scream. He told her of finding them, of the senseless, brutal way they had been taken from him, and of the consuming, impotent rage that had burned away the man he used to be, leaving only a hollow, vengeful shell. When he finished, his confession hung in the cold night air, raw and bleeding. He had given her his greatest burden, the source of all his pain. Maria did not offer him pity or comfort. She offered him understanding. She reached across the small fire and placed her hand on his arm. Then, in a quiet, steady voice, she gave him a gift in return. She did not speak of the fire and the ropes and the hatred that had stolen her family. Instead, She shared with him the life that had been lost. She told him about her father, a man with strong, gentle hands who could carve a perfect wooden bird in a single afternoon, and whose laughter was a deep, booming sound that could shake the very timbers of their small home. She spoke of her mother, who sang old songs from a land she had never seen as she wove blankets with patterns as bright and beautiful as a sunset. She gave him not her tragedy, but her treasures, the cherished memories that the fire could not turn to ash, their shared vulnerability. There, in the immense silence of the wilderness, forged the final, unbreakable link in the chain that bound them together. He looked at her, his eyes raw with the ghosts he had finally exorcised. He saw not just a reflection of his own pain, but a promise of life, of a strength he had forgotten existed. He leaned across the dying embers of the fire, his hand coming up to gently cup her jaw. His touch was hesitant, shockingly tender. He whispered her name, and it was not a word, but a prayer. And then he kissed her. It was a kiss born of shared grief and fierce loyalty, of a winter's worth of pent-up passion and a desperate, aching need for solace. It was a kiss that promised not just survival, but life. It was a moment of profound, shattering release, and in the heart of the desolate Badlands, two broken souls began to heal. The morning after, a new light was in the sky, and a new understanding rested between them. They rode on, their shared purpose now cemented by a fragile, powerful intimacy. Late that afternoon, they found it. The tracks of a large herd of cattle, driven hard and fast, their brands intentionally blurred by mud and dust. They followed the trail into a series of winding, narrow canyons. As the sun began to dip below the canyon walls, they dismounted, leaving the horses behind as they crept forward on foot. From a high, rocky ridge, they looked down into a hidden box canyon. The scene below confirmed their every suspicion. A dozen of Blackwood's men, Jed and Pike among them, were working around a large fire, reheating branding irons, a herd of at least 100 cattle. Their original brands, blotched and scarred, were being forced through a narrow chute. Where the double B brand was burned hissingly into their hides, the air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and burnt hair. They had found the proof they needed. Jake and Maria lay flat on the rocky ground, hidden behind a cluster of boulders, their hearts pounding with a mixture of triumph and fear. They had done it. They had the evidence that could destroy Silas Blackwood. Jake shifted his weight, leaning forward slightly to get a better count of the men below. His boot scraped against a loose piece of shale. It was a small stone, no bigger than his thumb. But as it dislodged and tumbled down the steep incline, the sound it made, a tiny, rattling clatter, was as loud as a gunshot in the charged silence of the canyon. Down below, one of the men looked up, his head cocked. "What was that?" he called out. Every man froze, their eyes scanning the darkening ridges that surrounded them. Jed's gaze swept across the rock face, and for a terrifying second, his eyes seemed to lock directly onto their hiding place. He squinted, then slowly raised his rifle to his shoulder. The world exploded in a deafening crack. The rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, a sound that sealed their fate. They were discovered, trapped, and hopelessly outnumbered. The rifle shot was a flat, hard crack that shattered the evening stillness, followed instantly by the whine of a ricocheting bullet. In that split second, the world dissolved into chaos. The methodical, haunted bounty hunter vanished, and the Texas Ranger took his place. Jake reacted without thought, his body a weapon honed by years of instinct. He shoved Maria flat against the rock, his own body covering hers as a second shot splintered the stone where her head had been. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low, urgent growl. He drew his Colt, the motion fluid and economical, and returned fire. He did not aim to kill. He aimed to suppress, to sow confusion. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession toward the muzzle flashes below, the thunder of his pistol echoing the panicked shouts from the canyon floor. Maria lay pressed into the dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the terrifying sound of lead striking rock filled her ears. For a paralyzing moment, she was back in the root cellar, a helpless child listening to the sounds of violence. "Maria, move, now!" Jake's voice cut through her fear. He grabbed her arm, hauling her to her feet. "Run, keep low, head for the horses." She ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, her lungs burning. Jake followed a few paces behind, turning every few seconds to fire another shot, forcing Blackwood's men to keep their heads down. They scrambled along the rocky ridge, using the deepening twilight and the outcropping of boulders for cover. Below, the canyon was alive with gunfire, the rustlers fanning out, their shots growing wilder in the fading light. They were almost to the place where they had tied the horses when it happened. Jake paused to fire one last time, and in that moment of stillness, a bullet found its mark. He felt a white-hot, searing agony tear through his left thigh. It was as if he had been struck by a bolt of lightning, a brutal, physical shock that buckled his leg. A grunt of pain was forced from his lips, but he did not fall. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded his veins, overriding the pain. If he went down now, they were both dead. He pushed himself forward, a terrible limp in his stride. "Go!" he yelled, shoving her toward the horses. She saw his face then, pale and slick with sweat in the gloom. His jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. She saw the dark, wet stain spreading rapidly down his pant leg. Fear, sharp and cold, lanced through her, but there was no time for it. They reached the animals, who were dancing nervously, their eyes wide. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Jake hauled his wounded body into the saddle, his face a mask of agony. Maria was up and on her own horse an instant later. She kicked it into a gallop, and they plunged into the labyrinth of canyons, leaving the shouts and the gunfire behind them as darkness swallowed the world. They rode for hours, pushing the horses and themselves to the point of collapse. The initial surge of adrenaline that had kept Jake upright began to fade, replaced by waves of nausea and a deep, throbbing pain that seemed to suck the very life from him. He slumped forward in the saddle, his grip on the reins slackening, his body swaying with every jarring step of the horse. The roles were now completely, terrifyingly reversed. Maria, who had depended on his strength and skill for survival, was now the protector. She rode beside him, her hand on his back to keep him from falling, her eyes scanning the dark landscape for any sign of pursuit. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but overlaying it was a fierce, unwavering resolve. She had lost everyone she had ever loved. She would not lose him. When he finally began to slip from the saddle, his consciousness fading, she knew they could go no further. She guided their horses off the trail, into a thicket of overgrown mesquite. She slid from her horse and went to his side, easing his dead weight to the ground. He was a big man, and the effort of half carrying, half dragging him deeper into the brush was immense. His leg was on fire, and he was burning with a fever that was already taking hold. By a stroke of luck that felt like a prayer answered, she found it, a narrow fissure in a rock face, almost completely concealed by a curtain of wild grapevines. A cave. It was small and damp, but it was shelter. It was safety. She dragged him inside, into the cool, dark belly of the rock, and then, using a branch, she painstakingly erased their tracks from the trail, covering the entrance so that it was once again invisible. Inside the cave, she lit a small, shielded candle. In the flickering light, she looked at the wound. It was worse than she had feared. The bullet had passed clean through his thigh, but the entry and exit wounds were ragged and swollen, the flesh around them already turning a dark, angry purple. It was bleeding sluggishly, and the heat coming off his body was terrifying. Infection was setting in. Her mind, which had been a whirlwind of panic, suddenly grew calm and clear. She was no longer a frightened woman on the run. She was a healer. This was her domain. She knew what she had to do. Tearing a strip of cloth from her petticoat, she made a tight compress and pressed it against the wound to slow the bleeding. Then, leaving Jake to his fevered muttering, she slipped out of the cave. The moon was high, casting the Badlands in a stark, skeletal light. She moved with a quiet, desperate purpose, her eyes scanning the ground. She was searching for the plants her mother had taught her about, the wild pharmacy of the desert. She found a patch of yarrow, its feathery leaves perfect for staunching blood. She stripped bark from a willow tree, a potent remedy for fever and pain. She gathered a handful of usnea moss, a stringy, greenish lichen that grew on the branches of the junipers, knowing its power to fight the corruption of a wound. Returning to the cave, she went to work. She chewed the yarrow leaves into a poultice and packed it firmly into the wounds, then bound them tightly with fresh strips of cloth. She boiled the willow bark in their small tin pot over a tiny, smokeless fire she built deep in the cave, creating a bitter, potent tea. She gently washed his feverish skin, and when he was lucid enough to swallow, she made him drink. For 3 days and 3 nights, she was a tireless sentinel. She hunted, setting snares that caught 2 scrawny rabbits, which she made into a thin, nourishing broth. She sat at the mouth of the cave, Jake's pistol resting on her lap, and kept watch, her ears straining for the sound of riders. She was his shield, his nurse, his provider. Her determination was a flame that burned away her fear and exhaustion. Jake descended into the hell of a raging fever. He was lost in a delirious, burning landscape of memory and nightmare. He thrashed against the rock floor, his hands reaching for things that were not there. He was back in the ashes of his homestead, calling for his son. He was riding with the rangers, the sun beating down on him, and in the hazy, shifting fog of his delirium, he saw the face of the woman who tended to him, a gentle presence in the heart of his pain. He reached out, his fingers weakly closing around her wrist. His eyes, unfocused and glassy with fever, stared up at her. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a dry, broken thing. A faint smile touched his cracked lips. "Sarah, you came back to me." The name was a dagger of ice in Maria's heart. She froze, her hand hovering over his forehead. For a moment, she could not breathe. Sarah, in his delirium, in the deepest, most honest corners of his mind. He was with his wife. The kiss they had shared, the confessions whispered under the stars, the unbreakable bond she thought they had forged. All of it felt like a lie. She was a ghost, a stand-in for the woman he had truly loved, the woman whose memory still owned his heart. The pain was a bitter, physical thing, a crushing weight in her chest. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sharp, but she blinked them away. Her grief was a luxury she could not afford. He needed her, wounded and heartbroken. She continued her work. She held his hand, even as he called it Sarah's. She spooned broth into his mouth. She whispered soothing words when he cried out in his sleep, her own pain a silent, constant ache. On the 4th day, the fever broke. The fire that had been consuming him receded, leaving him weak and drenched in sweat, but lucid. He opened his eyes, and the first thing he saw was Maria, sitting beside him, her face pale and etched with exhaustion. And he saw something else in her dark eyes, a deep, profound sadness that had not been there before. A wall had been rebuilt between them, higher and colder than before. He remembered fragments from the fever, like pieces of a terrible dream, and he remembered whispering a name that was not hers. Shame, hot and heavy, flooded him. "Maria," he started, his voice a hoarse croak. She looked away. "You should rest." "No," he said, pushing himself up on one elbow. The effort exhausted him. I am sorry for what I said." "You were delirious," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You did not know." "That is no excuse," he insisted, his voice gaining a desperate urgency. He could not bear the distance he saw in her eyes. "Listen to me, please." She finally turned to look at him, her expression guarded. This was it, This was the conversation that would either save them or break them for good. He took a shaky breath. "For 5 years," he said, his voice raw with a pain that had nothing to do with his wound. "I have done nothing but live in the past. Sarah, she was my whole world. When I lost her and Thomas, the man I was died with them. I made a promise to them, to myself, that I would never let anyone get that close again. I was afraid that loving someone else would be a betrayal, that it would mean I was forgetting them, replacing them." He paused, gathering his strength. "When I met you, it terrified me. You were the first person to make me feel anything other than grief. And I fought it. But out there, in the Badlands, what I feel for you. Maria, it is not about her. It is not a replacement." He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her cheek. "It is new. It is about you. It is real, and it is powerful. And I have never felt anything like it. I am not trying to bring my wife back from the dead. I am trying to figure out how to build a life with you." Tears welled in her eyes as his words, raw and painfully honest, broke through the wall around her heart. She saw the truth in his gaze, the shame and the hope and the fear all mingled together, and she understood. They were a day out of the cave when they heard the riders. They were close, their voices carrying on the still morning air. Blackwood's men were still hunting, scouring the canyons with a relentless patience. Maria helped Jake into a narrow crevice between 2 boulders, and they held their breath as the horsemen passed less than 100 yards away. The cave was no longer safe. They had to keep moving. Their life became a slow, agonizing journey of survival. They were no longer predator and prey in the way Jake had once been. They were simply the hunted. Living like animals on the run, they traveled at night, using the stars to guide them, and hid during the day in whatever cover they could find. Jake's leg was healing, but it was a slow, painful process. He leaned on a makeshift crutch carved from a sturdy branch, and he leaned on her. Their survival was a silent dance of complete trust. He taught her how to muffle the sound of the horse's hooves with strips of blanket, how to use the wind to cover their scent, how to think like the men who were hunting them. She, in turn, found them food and water, changed the dressing on his wound with a gentle, practiced hand, and stood watch while he slept, her quiet strength a constant. Reassuring presence, their love, confessed in the dark intimacy of the cave, was now solidified by the harsh light of day. It was not a thing of passionate kisses and whispered promises, but of shared rations, of a steadying hand on a difficult climb, of a silent look that said, "I will not let you fall." It was a love forged in the face of death, and it was unbreakable. On a remote trail, a thin track barely visible in the vast wilderness, they saw him. He was a lone rider, a gaunt, bearded man on a tired-looking mule. As he drew closer, they saw he was a traveling preacher, a Bible clutched in one hand. His name was Brother Michael, and his eyes, when they met theirs, were filled not with suspicion, but with a weary kindness. Jake made a decision. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. He hailed the man, and as the preacher looked at the haggard, wounded man and the fiercely protective woman beside him, he listened. Jake spoke with the clipped authority of his past life as a lawman. He laid out the entire story, the murder of Maria's family, the land grab, the rustling operation in the hidden canyon, the attempted murder of them both. "We need you to get a message to the U.S. Marshal in Fort Griffin," Jake concluded, pressing a folded piece of paper with the crudely drawn map into the preacher's hand. "Tell him Silas Blackwood is running an outlaw army in redemption. Tell him we have proof. Tell him justice needs to be done." Brother Michael looked from the desperate couple to the paper in his hand. He saw the truth in their faces. "The Lord's work takes many forms," he said, his voice solemn. "I will deliver your message." He tucked the paper safely inside his Bible, gave them a final, compassionate look, and rode on, carrying their last, fragile hope with him. They watched him go until he was just a speck in the distance. Fort Griffin was 100 miles away, The preacher's journey would take a week, maybe more. And a U.S. Marshal would not just drop everything and ride on the word of a preacher. Help, if it was coming at all, was weeks away. Weeks they did not have. They were sitting by a small, hidden spring that night, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Jake's leg was stronger. He could walk without the crutch now, though he still had a pronounced limp. But they could not run forever. Their food was gone. Their horses were exhausted. Their luck was running out. "They will find us," Maria said, her voice a quiet statement of fact. "Sooner or later, they will find us out here." "I know," Jake said. He looked at her, at the strength that had blossomed in her, the resilience that had saved his life. He saw not a victim, but a warrior. A new resolve hardened in his eyes. He had spent 5 years running from his past, from his grief, from life itself. He was done running. "We cannot wait for a rescue that may never come," he said, his voice low but filled with a new, hard certainty. "Our only chance is to stop running and start fighting." Maria looked at him, her heart thudding. "Go back to redemption. It is the one place they will not expect us to go," he said. "We cannot win a war out here, but in that town, there are people who hate Blackwood as much as we do. The doctor, the boy Ben, others, maybe. People who are too scared to stand up on their own, but who might fight if they have someone to lead them." His words hung in the air, a terrifying, audacious plan. Their personal quest for vengeance had grown into something more. It was no longer just about them. It was about freeing an entire town from the grip of a tyrant. It was about transforming their pain into a fight for justice for all. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "This is our fight. Maria, we started it. We have to finish it." She met his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw no fear. He saw the same grim determination that he felt in his own soul. She nodded, a single sharp movement. The decision was made. They would not wait for justice to find them. They would ride back into the heart of darkness and bring the justice themselves. They returned to redemption as phantoms, slipping through the familiar streets under the cover of a moonless night. The town was not as they had left it. It had become a cage, its bars forged from fear. Blackwood's men were everywhere, their silhouettes patrolling the boardwalks, rifles held in the crooks of their arms. They moved in pairs, their spurs a cold, rhythmic jingle in the oppressive silence. Lanterns burned in the windows of the saloon and the sheriff's office all through the night, casting long, menacing shadows that danced and writhed like devils. Fear was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the town. People scurried from their homes to the mercantile and back again, their eyes downcast, their faces pinched and pale. The easy loitering and casual gossip of town life had vanished completely. Redemption was a town under occupation. Their destination was the livery stable, the place where their unlikely alliance had been born. It was the one place that offered a semblance of sanctuary, a place of shadows and forgotten corners. They slipped through a back window, their movements silent and practiced from weeks of living like hunted animals. The familiar smell of hay and horse was a strange comfort, a scent from a time that already felt a lifetime ago. They settled in the hayloft, their new command post, a tiny island of rebellion in a sea of tyranny. From their perch, they watched the town for 2 days, learning the patterns of the patrols, noting which townspeople seemed most cowed, and which ones carried a spark of defiance in their eyes. They had to choose their allies carefully. One wrong word to the wrong person would bring Blackwood's entire force down upon them. Their first visit was to Dr. Miller. They went to his small office behind the apothecary late at night, slipping through the alley and tapping softly on his back door. He opened it a crack, his face illuminated by the shaky flame of an oil lamp. His eyes were bloodshot, his hand trembled, and the air that drifted out smelled of stale whiskey and regret. "Go away," he hissed, trying to shut the door. Jake's boot was faster. He blocked the door, pushing it open with steady pressure. We need to talk. Doctor. Miller stumbled back into his cluttered office. Medical texts were piled haphazardly on every surface, competing for space with empty bottles. He was a man drowning in his own complicity, and the drink was the only thing keeping his head above water. "They will kill me if they find you here," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the curtained front windows. "They will kill you eventually anyway. One way or another," Jake said, his voice calm and hard. "Blackwood does not like loose ends. You signed the papers for the Flores family. You know the truth about Ben's brother. How many other lies have you put your name to?" The doctor sank into a chair, his face crumbling. "What can I do? I am one man. He has a dozen guns." It was Maria who spoke then, her voice cutting through his despair. She stepped forward into the lamplight. She was no longer the frightened girl who had come to Jake in the stable. Her time in the wilderness had stripped away everything but a core of tempered steel. "My father was one man," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a strength that made the doctor look up. "Ben's brother was one man. They stood for what was right. Your guilt is a luxury they were not afforded." Jake saw the flicker of shame in the doctor's eyes, the last ember of a conscience he had tried so hard to drown. "We are not asking you to face them alone," Jake continued. "We are asking you to be ready. When the time comes, you will have to choose a side. All we need to know is which side it will be." Miller stared at his shaking hands for a long moment. Then he looked from Maria's unyielding gaze to Jake's cold resolve. He gave a single, slow nod. A small, bitter tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. "God help us all," he whispered. Their next ally was Ben. They found him in the hayloft, the same one where they were hiding, his familiar territory. The boy was coiled tight with a mixture of fear and a burning, youthful rage. He had been forced to tend to the horses of the men who had murdered his brother. Every day was a fresh torment. "I saw you come back," he whispered, his eyes wide in the darkness. "I was hoping you would. The town is suffocating." "We need your help, Ben," Jake said. "We need to know Blackwood's plans. We need to know the strength of his men, when they ride out, when they sleep." "They are looking for you everywhere," Ben told them, his words coming in a rush. "Blackwood is like a caged wolf. He rides in every day, angrier than the last. He nearly beat a man to death last week just for spilling his drink. He is coming undone. He knows you saw the rustling operation. He is terrified the law will come." Ben became their eyes and ears. He fed them scraps of information, precious pieces of the puzzle they were assembling. He moved through the town like a ghost, his youth and his position making him all but invisible to Blackwood's arrogant gunmen. A spark of rebellion had been lit. It was small, fragile, and hidden in the deepest shadows, but it was there. Blackwood's paranoia, fueled by his failure to capture them, festered into a raging fury. He needed to reassert his dominance, to crush the whispers of defiance he could feel but not see. He needed to make an example, and his cruel, desperate gaze fell upon the one person who was known to have spoken to Jake Callahan before he left, the stable hand. Ben. They took him in the middle of the day. Jed and Pike dragged the boy out of the stable and into the main street. Ben fought, his fists flailing, but he was no match for the two brutes. They beat him into submission and hauled his limp body toward the town square. From the hayloft, Jake and Maria watched, their hearts turning to ice, a cold, killing rage, the likes of which he had not felt since the day he found his family. Rose in Jake's throat. He reached for his rifle, his knuckles white. "Not yet," Maria said, her hand firm on his arm. Her voice was a strained whisper, but it held him in check. "Wait." In a monstrous display of tyrannical power, Blackwood's men tied Ben to the thick hitching post in the center of the square. They stripped him to the waist, his young back pale and vulnerable in the harsh afternoon sun. The townspeople were forced from their homes and businesses, herded into the square by armed men. They were to be the audience for this grotesque theater of cruelty. Silas Blackwood rode into the square on his big black stallion. a figure of absolute, unrepentant authority. He dismounted and strode to the center, a long black whip coiled in his hand. "This boy has been consorting with outlaws," Blackwood announced, his voice booming across the silent, terrified crowd. "He has aided the bounty hunter Callahan and the florist girl. They are hiding somewhere. Like the rats they are. This boy knows where." He uncoiled the whip, its leather tail slithering in the dust. "And he is going to tell me I will break his body to break their spirit. Let this be a lesson to anyone who thinks they can defy me." This act of supreme cruelty, meant to terrify the town into absolute submission, had the opposite effect. It was too much. The private injustices, the daily humiliations, the simmering, unspoken hatred, it all coalesced into a single, shared moment of revulsion. To see the innocent, well-liked boy tied up like an animal, to be forced to watch his torment, shocked the people of Redemption out of their apathy. Their fear was still there, but now it was overshadowed by a deep and unifying rage. They saw in Ben's suffering their own degradation, and in Blackwood's sneering face, the true nature of the devil who ruled their lives. That night, the eve of the confrontation, the air in the hayloft was thick with the weight of impending death. Jake sat on an old crate, methodically cleaning and oiling his weapons. The soft, metallic click of the Colt's cylinder turning was the only sound. He was preparing for what he believed was his final battle. He was one man, with a still healing leg, against a dozen hardened gunmen. The odds were impossible, but he would not let them torture that boy. He would go down fighting, and he would take as many of them with him as he could. Maria watched him, her heart a tight, aching knot in her chest. She saw the grim finality in the set of his jaw, the detached focus in his eyes. He was building his walls again, shutting her out, preparing to die alone, and she could not bear it. Everything she had been through, the loss of her family, the fire, the flight through the wilderness, all of it had led to this one man, this one impossible chance at a future. The thought of losing him now was a pain greater than any she had ever known. She went to him, kneeling on the hay-strewn floor in front of him. He did not look up from his work. "Jake," she whispered. He continued to wipe down the barrel of his rifle with an oiled cloth, his movements precise and deliberate. Tears began to stream down her face, hot and silent. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Do not do this." He finally stopped, his hands going still. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "There is no other way. I will not let them do that to the boy." "This is not what I want," she cried, the words tumbling out in a torrent of long-suppressed fear and love. "When I came to you, all I had was hate. All I wanted was revenge. But that is not what I want anymore." She reached out, her hands covering his, stopping their grim work. "My quest for revenge is meaningless if you are not here. It is just another empty thing in an empty world. My only desire now is a future. Any future. A small house. A quiet life. But it has to have you in it." Her plea was not for vengeance. It was for his life. It was a raw, desperate confession of love. A choice for life over death. For a future over the past. Jake looked at her. Truly looked at her. He saw her tear-streaked face, the fierce love burning in her eyes, the strength that had saved him. In her. He did not see a ghost of Sarah. He did not see a replacement for the life he had lost. He saw the promise of a new one. He saw a sunrise after a long and brutal night. And, in that moment, the vow he had made 5 years ago, the promise that had kept his heart imprisoned in a tomb of grief, finally, completely, shattered. The ghosts of Sarah and Thomas did not vanish. Instead, they seemed to recede, to find a peaceful place in his memory. He realized that loving Maria was not a betrayal of them. It was an affirmation of the life they would have wanted him to live. It was the ultimate act of defiance against the senseless violence that had taken them. To live, to love again, was to win. A profound, Shuddering sigh escaped his lips, the release of 5 years of carefully guarded pain. He let the rifle fall to the side and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. He held her tight, as if she were the only anchor in a raging sea. "I will survive," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he had thought long dead. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "I promise you, I will survive. This is not about revenge anymore. This is not about the past. This fight, tomorrow, it is for the life we are going to build together." He kissed her then, a kiss of profound, soul-deep commitment. It was a kiss that sealed a new promise, not of solitude and vengeance, but of a shared future. The cowboy who had sworn off love had finally found his reason to live. The next morning, the sun rose into a hazy, blood-red sky. The town square was silent, a stage set for a tragedy. Ben was still tied to the post, his head hanging in exhaustion. Blackwood and his men were assembled, their arrogance on full display. The townspeople were once again forced to watch, their faces a mixture of terror and a new, steely resolve. Blackwood strode forward, the whip once again in his hand. "Last chance, boy," he snarled. "Where are they?" Ben lifted his head and spat a mouthful of bloody saliva into the dust at Blackwood's feet. Blackwood's face contorted with rage. He raised the whip high. As the leather lash began its descent, a loud ringing clang echoed from the blacksmith's workshop at the edge of the square. It was the sound of a hammer striking an anvil, a sound as familiar to the town as the church bell. A second later, the sound was followed by the deafening boom of a buffalo rifle fired from the workshop's window. It was not a shot aimed at anyone. It was a signal. Blackwood and his men whirled around, stunned by the audacity. The whip fell from Blackwood's hand, forgotten. It was all the time they needed. The window of the doctor's office flew open, and the stooped, trembling figure of Dr. Miller appeared, leveling a double-barreled shotgun with surprising steadiness. From the roof of the mercantile, the proprietor appeared with an old Winchester. A door of another house opened, and another, old rifles, shotguns, pistols. Weapons that had not been fired in years were suddenly in the hands of shopkeepers, farmers, and liverymen. The silent, terrified crowd erupted. The streets of redemption, so long choked by fear, descended into the chaos of a full-scale uprising. For a stunned, silent moment, the town square was a frozen tableau. The upstart blacksmith, the grim-faced doctor, the enraged rancher, and the defiant boy tied to the post. Then the moment shattered, and the world erupted into a maelstrom of sound and fury. Blackwood's men, caught completely by surprise, scrambled for cover, their arrogance replaced by panicked confusion. They were used to being a pack of wolves terrorizing sheep, but the sheep had suddenly grown teeth. The chaotic street battle was a desperate, swirling thing. Gunsmoke, thick and acrid, filled the air, obscuring the sun and turning the morning into a hellish twilight. Bullets splintered wooden storefronts and whined off the blacksmith's anvil. Men shouted, some in rage, some in pain. It was not a battle of tactics and precision. It was a raw, primal explosion of a community's long-suppressed rage. In the heart of the chaos, Jake Callahan became the eye of the storm. The instincts of the Texas Ranger, dormant for so long, took over with a cold and absolute clarity. His leg was a searing agony, a constant reminder of his body's limitations, but his mind was sharp as a razor. He could not run, so he would have to outthink them. "Doctor, stay in the window! You have the best angle on the street!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the din. "Ben, get to the general store! Barricade the door!" To his surprise, the boy, freed in the initial confusion by the store owner, did not run and hide. He grabbed a fallen pistol and nodded, his young face a mask of grim determination. Jake moved slowly, deliberately, using a horse trough for cover. He organized the raw fury of the townspeople into something resembling a strategy. He saw the crossfire opportunities, the moments to advance, the moments to hold their ground. He was turning a mob into a militia, his quiet, confident commands a point of focus in the swirling violence. He was no longer a lone hunter. He was a leader, a protector, a role he thought he had buried with his past. Maria, too, was transformed. The pistol Jake had given her felt like a natural extension of her arm. She fought with a ferocity born not of hatred, but of a desperate, powerful love. She was not just defending herself. She was defending her future, her home, her town, and the man who had given her a reason to hope again. When the elderly store owner fumbled while reloading his rifle, she stood in front of him, firing her pistol to keep Blackwood's men back. She helped the doctor's wife drag a wounded farmer into the safety of the apothecary, her small frame straining with the effort, her face set with a courage that inspired everyone who saw it. She was the heart of the rebellion, a fierce, blazing symbol of their fight for freedom. The battle raged, street by bloody street, the townspeople, fighting for their homes and their lives on familiar ground, proved to be a surprisingly effective force, one by one. Blackwood's hired guns were cornered, disarmed, or driven to ground. The tide of the battle turned, the broad chaos of the uprising slowly constricting until only the central, inevitable conflict remained. The supporting players fell away, leaving the two main actors on the stage of the muddy main street, Jake Callahan and Silas Blackwood. Blackwood stood near the saloon, his fine coat splattered with mud, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. His empire was crumbling around him, his authority shattered by the very people he had terrorized. All that was left was a raw, unadulterated hatred for the man who had caused it all.
"Callahan,"
he bellowed, his voice hoarse,
"this is between you and me."
Jake limped into the center of the street, the pain in his leg a dull, constant throb. He looked at the man who had destroyed Maria's family, the man whose greed was a cancer that had poisoned everything it touched. His promise to Maria echoed in his heart, a steadying rhythm against the frantic beat of the battle. It always was. "Blackwood," he said, his voice quiet. Their duel was not the clean, stylized ritual of two gunslingers. It was a raw, brutal, and ugly confrontation in the grime and filth of the street, a perfect personification of their conflict. It was Jake's redeemed love against Blackwood's unrepentant greed. They exchanged shots, the bullets chewing up the mud around their feet. Blackwood was a powerful man, his movements fueled by a lifetime of arrogance and rage. Jake, hampered by his leg, was slower, more deliberate. He used cover, his movements economical, his aim steady. The fight devolved into a desperate, close-quarters struggle. Blackwood lunged, and they grappled in the mud. Two forces of nature locked in a primal battle. Blackwood was stronger, but Jake was fueled by something more potent than strength. He was fueled by a promise. He fought for the feel of Maria's hand in his, for the foundation of a new home, for the quiet peace of a future he had never believed he would have. He saw an opening. He drove the butt of his pistol into Blackwood's side, the blow forcing a sharp gasp from the rancher. As Blackwood staggered back, Jake kicked his legs out from under him. The big man fell hard into the mud, his pistol flying from his grasp. Jake stood over him, his own Colt steady in his hand, the muzzle aimed directly at the heart of his enemy. It was over. He had won. He looked down at the defeated man, the architect of all his and Maria's suffering. The ghost of the vengeful bounty hunter whispered in his ear, a seductive, deadly hiss. One bullet, and it would all be finished. The perfect revenge. But then he looked up. Across the street, standing in the doorway of the saloon, was Maria. Her face was streaked with soot and tears. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the doorframe, but her eyes were fixed on him. They were filled with fear, but also with an unwavering trust, a desperate hope. He saw in her face the future he had promised her, a future built on something more than blood and vengeance. He realized then, with a clarity that was absolute, that killing Blackwood in cold blood would not be a victory. It would be a surrender to the very darkness he had fought so hard to escape. It would be building their new home on a foundation of murder, poisoning it from the start. That was not the justice Maria deserved. Justice, he finally understood, was not the same as revenge. With a slow, deliberate movement that felt as if it took all the strength he had left, he lowered his gun. At that precise moment, a new sound cut through the tense silence. The thunder of a dozen horses riding hard into town. A posse of men, armed and organized, galloped down the main street, their horses splashing through the mud. At their head was a tall, grim-faced man with a silver star pinned to his vest. Marshall Reed, drawn by the urgent message of a traveling preacher, had arrived. They reined in their horses, taking in the stunning scene before them. The defiant townspeople, armed with their antique weapons, holding the last of Blackwood's men at gunpoint, the smoke still curling from the rooftops. And in the center of it all, the wounded bounty hunter standing over the defeated rancher, his gun lowered in a gesture not of weakness, but of ultimate strength. Blackwood, seeing the marshal's star, seemed to snap. His arrogance and fury boiled over into a final, hateful rant.
"You are too late, Marshal!"
he screamed, scrambling to his feet.
"This town is mine. I built it. I dealt with the Flores thieves just like I will deal with all of you. They are all mine to command or to kill."
He lunged for his fallen gun, his face a mask of madness. He never reached it. One of the deputies fired a single expert shot that kicked the pistol away into the mud. Blackwood's own words, a full and furious confession screamed in front of a federal officer, had sealed his fate more surely than any bullet from Jake's gun. Justice, formal and final, was served. Marshall Reed and his men took Blackwood and his surviving gunmen into federal custody, shackling them and loading them onto a prison wagon. The long, dark reign of Silas Blackwood was over. The battle was won. Redemption was free. The quiet that settled over the town in the aftermath was heavy with the cost of that freedom. The streets were scarred, the buildings pocked with bullet holes. But as the people emerged from their homes and hiding places, there was a new light in their eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a weary but profound sense of pride. They had fought for their own town. They had saved themselves. Maria, once the town pariah, was surrounded. The doctor's wife embraced her. The blacksmith, his face grimed with soot, gave her a respectful nod. Ben's mother clasped her hands, her eyes streaming with tears of gratitude. In the crucible of the battle, the old lines of prejudice had been burned away. She was not the outcast Flores girl anymore. She was one of them. She was a hero of redemption. Several weeks later, a gentle peace had settled over the town. The sounds of hammering and sawing had replaced the echo of gunshots as the community worked together to rebuild. The air was clear, and the future, once a terrifying unknown, now felt as wide and promising as the vast western sky. Jake and Maria stood on the plot of land by the river where her family's home had once been. The scorched earth was healing, covered now with a carpet of new green grass and dotted with the vibrant colors of Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets. In the center of the plot, a new foundation was being laid, the fresh-cut pine timber smelling clean and sweet in the warm afternoon sun. It was small, humble, but it was a beginning. Jake was leaning on a cane, his limp now a part of him, a permanent reminder of the price of their freedom. But his face was relaxed. The hard, haunted lines around his eyes softened. His gun belt, the symbol of his old life, the tool of the bounty hunter and the avenger, was gone. It was hanging on a peg inside the livery stable, gathering dust, its purpose served. He looked out at the vast, open plains, then turned his gaze to Maria. Her hair was loose, blowing in the gentle breeze from the river, and her face, finally free from the shadows of grief and fear, was beautiful. "I am finally home," he said, his voice quiet. She smiled, A true, radiant smile that lit up her entire being. She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. They stood together in the warm sunlight, their embrace speaking of a future that was no longer a dream, but a tangible reality they would build together, plank by plank. Their love, forged in the darkest of tragedies and tested by the hottest of fires, was their ultimate victory. The cowboy who had sworn to never love again had found in her not just a reason to live, but a reason to heal. Their story did not end with a dramatic flourish or a ride into the sunset, but with the quiet, powerful, and deeply precious promise of a new beginning. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.